Chester Bennington was 41 when the voice that had carried millions through their darkest moments went silent forever. On July 20th, 2017, the world learned that the lead singer of Linkin Park had died at his home in California. And for a moment, the news felt impossible to accept. This was the man whose screams had sounded like survival, the man whose voice had torn through songs about pain, numbness, anger, trauma, and the desperate need to be heard. For an entire generation, Chester was not just a rock singer. He was the sound of everything they could not say out loud. He made depression sound powerful. He made rage sound human. He made loneliness feel less private. And then suddenly, the man who had helped so many people stay alive was gone. The shock moved across the world with brutal speed. Fans opened their phones and saw the headline. Radio stations began playing Linkin Park songs with a different kind of weight. Old live performances spread across the internet, but they no longer felt like simple concert memories. They felt like evidence of a pain that had always been there, hiding in plain sight. Songs like Crawling, Numb, In the End, and Breaking the Habit were replayed again and again, and every lyric seemed to cut deeper than before. What once sounded like an anthem now sounded like a warning. What once gave comfort now carried the unbearable question. How much of Chester's pain had the world been singing along to without truly understanding it? That was why his death felt different from ordinary celebrity news. Linkin Park had not simply entertained people. They had lived inside the emotional lives of millions of listeners. Their songs played during adolescence, isolation, family conflict, depression, heartbreak, and the years when young people felt too angry or too ashamed to explain what was happening inside them. Chester's voice had become a place where those feelings could finally go. So when the news broke, fans were not just mourning a singer. They were mourning the person who had screamed the words they never knew how to say. What made Chester Bennington's death so devastating was the contrast between the public voice and the private silence. On stage, he was explosive. He could scream with a force that seemed almost impossible for one body to hold. He could stand before tens of thousands of people and make every person in the crowd feel as if he was reaching directly into their chest. But behind that power was a man who had spoken openly about trauma, addiction, depression, and the wounds that followed him from childhood into adulthood. That contrast made the grief feel personal. Chester had never sounded like someone pretending to understand pain. He sounded like someone who knew it too well. Fans heard that truth in the cracks of his voice, in the way he bent a note until it sounded like it might break, in the way he could move from a whisper to a scream as if both came from the same wound. After his death, people began searching through his final performances, interviews, expressions, and lyrics, looking for signs they might have missed. But tragedy often changes the past after the ending arrives. It makes ordinary moments feel like warnings. It turns every scream into a confession and every silence into something heavier. The cruelest part was that Chester did not die after the world stopped listening. He died while his voice was still saving people. He died while fans were still standing in crowds, singing his words back to him, believing that if someone could express pain that clearly, maybe he had found a way through it. But pain does not always disappear just because it becomes art. Sometimes the artist gives people a map out of the darkness while still being lost inside it himself. And that is where this story begins. Not with the fame, not with the awards, not with the stadiums, but with the morning the world realized that the man who screamed for everyone else had been fighting a silence no crowd could hear. Chester Bennington's death was not only the end of a voice. It was the moment millions of people looked back at the songs that had saved them and wondered whether they had also been hearing a goodbye all along. Before Chester Bennington became the voice of Linkin Park, before the stadiums, the awards, the screaming crowds, and the songs that millions would turn to in their darkest moments, he was a boy from Phoenix, Arizona, carrying wounds he did not yet know how to name. His early life was marked by pain, instability, and trauma that would follow him long after childhood ended. Chester later spoke openly about the abuse he suffered when he was young, the emotional damage it left behind, and the way those experiences shaped his struggles with depression, addiction, and self-worth. This matters because the darkness in his music was never just a performance. It came from somewhere real. Before the world heard him scream, he had already spent years trying to survive feelings that were too heavy for a child to carry. Music became one of the few places where that pain could move. It gave him a way to release what had been trapped inside him, a way to turn confusion into sound and hurt into something that could be heard. In Phoenix, long before fame, Chester was not yet an icon for broken people. He was one of them, a sensitive boy growing into a young man, looking for a place to put anger, shame, loneliness, and grief. That is why his later voice felt so different from ordinary rock vocals. It did not sound trained only by technique. It sounded shaped by survival. Every scream seemed to carry the force of something buried for years, finally breaking through the surface. As Chester grew older, that voice began searching for a stage. Before Linkin Park, there was Grey Daze, the Arizona band where he first started turning personal pain into public sound. These early years were not glamorous. They were small stages, local shows, rough recordings, and the uncertain life of a young singer trying to prove that his voice mattered. But even then, there was something unmistakable about him. Chester could sing with vulnerability, then explode into a scream that sounded less like performance and more like release. It was raw, emotional, and impossible to ignore. Grey Daze gave him his first real outlet, but it was also the beginning of a deeper pattern. Chester's gift came from the same place as his suffering. The more honestly he sang, the more people felt it. The more pain he released through music, the more powerful the music became. But pain does not vanish just because it becomes a song. It follows the person back off stage. That is the tragedy hidden inside this part of his story. Chester's voice was forming into something extraordinary, but so was the burden behind it. He had not yet become the frontman of one of the biggest bands in the world. He had not yet screamed "crawling" or "numb" in front of thousands, but the emotional language was already there. A young man from Arizona had found a way to make suffering sound enormous, and soon the world would hear it. When Chester Bennington joined Linkin Park, his voice found the machine powerful enough to carry it to the world. The band did not sound like traditional rock, and that was exactly why they connected so quickly. They mixed heavy guitars, electronic textures, hip-hop rhythm, and emotional confession into something that felt built for a new generation. When Hybrid Theory arrived in 2000, it did not simply introduce a band. It gave millions of young people a soundtrack for the anger, pressure, loneliness, and numbness they had never been able to explain. Chester's voice was the emotional center of that sound. Mike Shinoda's rap verses gave the songs structure and tension, but Chester's screams made them feel like release. In Crawling, he sounded trapped inside his own skin. In the End, he made failure feel universal. In One Step Closer, he turned frustration into something explosive. And suddenly, Linkin Park was everywhere. Radio, MTV, posters, burned CDs, school headphones, bedroom walls, and the private lives of fans who felt misunderstood by the world around them. The success was massive, but it was not empty. People loved Linkin Park because the music sounded like what they were carrying inside. Chester did not sing pain from a distance. He sounded as if he was standing inside it, screaming from the middle of the room. That was why his voice became so powerful. It gave fans permission to feel broken without feeling alone. With Meteora, the connection only deepened. Numb became one of the band's defining songs because it captured the exhaustion of trying to meet expectations until there is nothing left of yourself. For millions of listeners, Chester became the person who could say the unsayable. He was not just performing songs, he was translating emotional damage into sound, and the world was singing it back to him. But the brighter Linkin Park became, the more painful the contradiction grew. Chester was helping people survive feelings that he was still fighting himself. Behind the sold-out shows, awards, and global success, the old wounds did not disappear. Trauma does not vanish because a crowd screams your name. Addiction does not lose its grip because an album goes multi-platinum. Depression does not become lighter because the world calls you a hero. And that was the quiet tragedy inside Chester's fame. The very voice that made fans feel saved came from a man who was still trying to save himself. Songs like Breaking the Habit, Given Up, and later One More Light began to feel, in hindsight, like emotional warnings spread across years. Given Up carried one of his most devastating screams, not just as a vocal moment, but as a sound of total collapse. Breaking the Habit sounded like someone trying to escape a cycle before it destroyed him. And One More Light, released near the end of his life, became almost unbearable after his death because it seemed to ask the question fans would later ask about him. Who cares if one more light goes out? The answer, after July 20th, 2017, was millions. Yet during his life, Chester had to carry the impossible role of being both wounded and healing for others. The audience needed his pain because it helped them understand their own. The industry needed his voice because it made the band unforgettable. But what did Chester need when the show ended, when the lights went down, when the screaming crowd became silence? That is the question sitting at the center of his story. Linkin Park gave him a place to turn suffering into art, but art could not erase the suffering itself. The world heard strength in his screams. Maybe the truth was more heartbreaking. Those screams were not proof that he had defeated the darkness. They were proof that he was still fighting it. When Linkin Park returned to the stage after Chester Bennington's death, it was not a comeback. It was a goodbye. On October 27, 2017, at the Hollywood Bowl in Los Angeles, the band held Linkin Park and Friends Celebrate Life in honor of Chester Bennington, a memorial concert that turned grief into sound. But the most powerful image was not the lights, the guests, or the size of the crowd. It was the empty space where Chester should have been. For years, that stage position had belonged to him. The man who could bend his body into a scream, grip the microphone like he was holding on to life itself, and make thousands of people feel seen in the same moment. Now his bandmates stood there without him. The songs were still there. The fans were still there. The lights were still there. But the voice that had made everything feel alive was missing. During the memorial, artists and friends came forward to sing the songs Chester once carried, but every performance felt haunted by absence. When the crowd sang his parts, it became clear how deeply his voice had entered people's lives. They were not just repeating lyrics. They were trying to fill a silence that could not truly be filled. The Hollywood Bowl became more than a concert venue that night. It became a place where an entire generation mourned together. Fans who had grown up with Hybrid Theory, survived adolescence with Meteora, and later heard One More Light as something almost too painful to revisit. Chester's death had made the songs heavier, but the memorial made them communal. It showed that his voice had not only belonged to a band, it had belonged to millions of people who had used it to survive their own darkness. But Chester Bennington's legacy cannot be reduced to the way he died. That would be too small for a life that gave so much to people who were hurting. He was a frontman, a father, a friend, a survivor, a wounded man, and one of the most emotionally recognizable voices in modern rock. Through Linkin Park, he helped change the sound of the 2000s, but more importantly, he changed the way millions of listeners understood their own pain. He made vulnerability sound explosive. He made trauma sound like something that could be screamed instead of hidden. He made songs for people who felt trapped inside themselves, and for years, those songs became lifelines. After his death, fans returned to the music differently. Numb no longer sounded only like teenage frustration. Crawling no longer sounded only like inner conflict. One More Light became almost impossible to hear without thinking of the man who sang it. That is the strange cruelty of losing an artist like Chester. The songs that once helped people heal also become places where grief lives. And yet, that is also why his voice remains. It continues to reach people in bedrooms, cars, hospital rooms, crowded arenas, and lonely nights. It still tells them that pain is real, that anger is real, that feeling broken does not make them invisible. Chester once screamed so others could feel less alone. In the end, the world could not save him from the silence he carried. But the voice he left behind still saves people every day. And maybe that is the most heartbreaking part of his story. Chester Bennington is gone. But somewhere, Someone is still pressing play and hearing him say what they cannot.